Hey, welcome to this Programming for Cultural Heritage demo video. Today we're going to be looking at MARC XML, and specifically MARC XML files from the data foundry of the National Library of Scotland. So MARC is a pretty ubiquitous data format for libraries. In this specific serialization, it's presented as XML, and so you'll find this as different serializations. So there's MARC binary and MARC XML, and even MARC and JSON, etc. In this case, we're going to be working with MARC just because that's the file type data serialization that this site is offering, and so we're going to kind of dig into how to use PyMarc, which is a Python module, to open up these XML files and start pulling some data out of them. So to get started, we're going to select a data set from this data foundry site. And so this site is the National Library of Scotland site. It has a number of data sets available on it. Under the data tab, there's these metadata collections, which is, they have, collections of digitized assets, but they also have the metadata for different collections as well. And so most of these here are available as MARC XML and also Dublin Core. So I'm just going to pick one at random. Let's do this moving image archive. So there's 6,000 records, so it's not huge, which is good. It's available as MARC XML and as Dublin Core. So both of these are standards, and it really, if you're familiar with one or the other, it's better to pick which data format you are more familiar with. In this case, we're going to do MARC XML because not only is it pretty, it's available from many places. You'll find lots of MARC XML files from different libraries and institutions. So to get started with this one, we're going to download the data. And so there's only 6,000 files, so or records, so it's not a huge data file. You can see it's only, 2 megabytes compressed and about 20 megabytes uncompressed. So we're going to extract it and open up and look what's in there. And so we can see that there's 3 files here. There's the Dublin Core. This one is for the moving image archive catalog. There's a file for the Dublin Core, for the MARC file, and the text file. So we're going to be working with the MARC file today. So this is a small enough file. It's only about 20 megabytes, so we can actually open it up in our editor to see what it looks like. So if we drag this file into our editor and take a look, we'll see that there is lots of XML stuff, right? And so this is nice. XML is good in the sense that you can read it, it's human readable and it kind of makes sense. But this is not formatted, it's not pre-printed or anything like that, so it's very kind of confusing. So you could try to use your editor to format the entire file just to see it. But if you imagine if you're working with something much larger, you might want to maybe just select a subset of records and try to format it. In this case, we can use our editor to actually indent the entire file, and it will work because it's only about 20 megabytes. So it'll take a second there to chew on that. And what we basically want to do is formatting it so we can understand what kind of data is in there and what the format is that we want to pull stuff out of. So MARC records are basically this container that contains metadata, and there's various types of fields that contain different subpieces of field data for that record. The big thing is, the leader, which lots of this is legacy based, so there's a lot of like secret codes and like kind of inside knowledge about, what certain variables or certain characters in certain positions mean. If you're starting to get into the real nitty gritty of MARC records and using them for system processing, stuff like that, you need to know that. For our purposes, we just mostly need to know what are in these subfields that have the different pieces of metadata that we might want to pull out. So we could look through this file and see some common stuff. We see a lot of 653s, and so we could look up what that means. 856s, which looks like the URL to the asset, or at least a web page about the asset. And so we would want to kind of decide what fields we want to pick out of this record and understand what we want to do with it. So in this case, we could say like, okay, let's pull out the title and the subject headings. Let's say that. So we'd have to know what each one of these fields means and what the context of it and the subfield and the code that it represents. So for example, if we want to find out what this field 653 is, we just need to go to the MARC website, So I just searched LC MARC 653, and so this is the detailed page about what is actually in the 653 field, and so this is a uncontrolled index term. So this is like a subject heading, but it's not controlled. It's not using any specific vocabulary, and so it says uncontrolled index term, and this is stored in the subfield code A. So we go here and say A is the uncontrolled term itself, right? So there could be these other subfields in there too. And so the first indicator is empty, so no information provided. And the second indicator is 0, so that means it's a topical term. So we know that this is the uncontrolled field, and there is a topical term stored in it. So that's kind of like a subject heading, so we probably want to use that. We'd want to kind of get a sense to see if there's a lot of 653 fields in this record, and then you kind of assume, okay, this institution stores their terms in the 653 field. And they probably are uncontrolled because they don't use any specific vocabulary like thing like Library of Congress subject headings or anything like that. So that looks like pretty good. 653, we'll use that to pull out topical terms. So for example, this one had a 6 in the indicator 2, so that's a genre form term. So we probably want to pull out, we want to keep track of what the indicator 2 is so that we would know what type of term it is. That could be useful. And then we want to pull out the title, and so I know that the title is stored in 245. So if we look at 245 documentation, it has information about it, and this is in subfield A, and there's subfield A, that's the title, right? So 254A is our title, and then 653A is the subject headings, right? All right, so this is an XML file, so we could potentially just use our XML knowledge to parse it and pull out pieces of the data. But there's actually a module that we can use that makes this a little bit easier. And so the module is called PyMark. And so this module will help us process MARC files and pull out different pieces of it. And so we can look at how to get installed. So we're going to use pip install to install PyMark. And then it says it can open these binary files, and it can also open XML here. And so this is telling you basically how to use PyMark to parse an XML file. So it gives you two options here. You can parse an entire XML file at once, or you can kind of, if it's really large, you can kind of import pieces of it and iterate through it. But this is a pretty small file, so we'll parse it all at once. But first we need to install this, right? So make sure we have installed. So we'll check. I'm going to open up a terminal here. And I'm just going to go to my downloads directory and go into the file directory where I downloaded it, moving image archive. Alright, so there's our 3 files. There's our MARC file. And so what we're going to do is make sure we have PyMark installed by just running the pip install command. So we're going to say pip3 and install PyMark. Alright, so it successfully installed that, and so now we have it in our system and we can use it. So I'm going to make a new file here and save it and call it parse.py. Alright, so let's look at the example that they give in the documentation here. So it says to parse the contents of a MARC XML record, you can import PyMark. You're going to import this specific piece, parse XML to array. So let's put that in here. And then it says records, parse XML to array, and then you pass the path to the file, XML file. So we know the path to XML file is called moving images archive dataset MARC. So let's put that in there. And it's in the same directory, so we don't need to put a path or relative path. It's just completely just have it's in the same directory. So we're just going to run this and see if it works at all, right? We're getting errors. So we're going to run Python 3 parse. Alright, so no errors. So what we can do is like console log this, right? Or sorry, print this. And so we can see it's the representation of a PyMark record object, right? So it's a list of them, so it's a big list of all the records it found, and so we could iterate through that. But now we need to know like how to interact with these Python PyMark objects, right? And so if we look here, we could see we want to find an example of reading. And so, for example, they have these built-in things where you can say, okay, if you're going to loop through it, you can say record.title, and that would print the title. So let's try that. Let's try writing a for loop. So we'll say for record in records. We'll say print record.title, and it's a little method, so we put the parentheses there. So let's try running that and see what it does. So it worked, maybe surprisingly worked, right? And so basically it printed all the title. And so you're saying like, well, okay, what's that title mean? And so this PyMark library has some kind of convenience things built into it. One of them is this title. So Mark varies in how people use it, but almost always there's a 245 title field. And so knowing that this library provides this little convenience function to get to the title. But if we want more control about it, we can also do something like this, right? So here they're saying print the specific field, subfield tag, and then the specific field number, and then the subfield code, right? So we could try doing this instead. Instead of saying just print title, we can say try printing the 245 field, subfield A. Let's see if that works the same way. Yeah, right? So same idea. So now we know that we can access the different pieces of the record and the fields. The only other thing we might need to know now is we talked about this indicator stuff, right? So for the 653 fields, we know that their indicator tells us what kind of term it is, if it's like a topical term or person or genre form, etc. So we might want to figure out how to get access to the indicators. So we'll look at the documentation somewhere here. Alright, so I didn't see any description on how to get the indicators on this documentation page. I did notice they if you're trying to read multiple fields, then you might want to use this option they suggest here for gathering many fields at once. So for example, for us the 653 fields there's going to be multiples of them, so you can actually say get all these fields of a certain type using this for loop. But I still didn't see anything about indicators, so I'm just going to kind of Google it and see what we come up with. Here's some more documentation. Let's take a look here. So this is the API docs, so it talks about the reader, talks about the record, right? So records have certain pieces of information. And so these are these like convenience things, right? Where like the title, it'll pull out the title for you, like this one. So let's do a search for indicator. Alright, so it says indicator 1 and indicator 2 are ways to get access to the indicators. So let's test that, right? Let's see if that works for us. So we can, so we know we want the 245 field, and it's in subfield A, but we can see in the 245 field if the if there's an indicator. So here's indicator 0, 1 is 0, and 2 is 0. So let's just test that to make sure we can actually access that. So we'll say indicator 1, and we'll say indicator 2. Right, so let's see what that does. Yeah, so they're both 0, so at least we can access the indicators now. All right, so we know we want to access 245 and subfield A, and there's only going to be one of those, right? There's only one title. But then the problem is here, we wanted to get these 653 fields, subfield A. So we need to gather all of them. So let's just see what happens if we just try to print the 653. So we'll say print record 653. Let's just see what it does. Alright, so it's printing them. I'm not sure if this is like for one record or for multiple of them, so let's just print this little line here just to say this is the end of the record. Let's try it again. Yeah, so it's just printing kind of one of them, right? And so this was the problem I just mentioned earlier. So if we look at the documentation again, you know, there's multiple of these fields, and so they gave the example of if you wanted to get multiple records, you could use this record get fields, right? So let's try that. So we're going to get the 653 field, and then we'll print out the field. And we'll leave in this dotted line here just to show the end of the record, right? So we'll print that for each record. All right, so that's better, right? So now we see all of the different fields for a single record that are all, because they're all stored in the 653, but they're repeated, so we want to get all of them. And so what we can do, it's also showing us kind of like at a glance the indicator that it's for that specific field and the subfield A, right? So what we want to do is probably maybe turn this into a JSON file or save this out somewhere so we can do something else with it, like visualize it or do something sort of, some analysis on it. So let's make a record for, you know, a new record for each one of these pieces of data, so we can kind of aggregate it. And so what we want to do is decide if we care, if we want to store these metadata fields, if, you know, what type of record or what type of subject it is. So we probably do, but then we need to know, like, you know, we don't want to have to accommodate every single possibility, right? So for every single possibility, it would mean topical, personal, corporate, meeting, chronological, geographical, non-reform. So we probably just want to kind of maybe just test to see how many types there are first, right? So let's make a new list, a new dictionary here. We'll call this types, or we'll call this uncontrolled, or we'll call it subject heading types. We'll make it an empty dictionary, and then we'll grab the indicator, right, to double check which indicator it's stored in. So second indicator, so we'll grab this indicator 2, and we'll say if the indicator 2 is not in the subject heading types, then we'll make it set to 0. And then we'll add 1 to it, right? Alright, so at the end here, comment that out, we'll just print out this and see what we get. Alright, so we have, most of them have 0, which again means topical. Then we have some 5 geographical, and then we have 6, which is genre form. So most of these other ones we don't need, so we don't really need to keep track of what types they are. So we basically, our record would maybe look like, if we're going to do something with this, we could say, you know, our record would look something like this, right? We'd have the title, then we'd have topical, and then we'd have geographic, and then we have form, the genre form, right? And that's kind of all we need to represent each one of these records. So let's do that for each one of these. We'll say, let's make a record for each record as we loop through it, right? So we'll create a new variable. We already use record here, so we can't call it record. So we'll call it data, and we'll set this to none, and we'll set these to empty lists, right? So we have a new variable called data every time it loops through a record, it creates that. And so what we want to do is set the title. So we'll say data title equals record, right? And it's in the 245 field, and it's in subfield A. Alright, so that's set, and then we just want to add in the subject heading for each one of these types, right? So we need to test for what type it is. So we'll say, we can kind of comment this out, because this was for our information gathering there. So we could test this, and we could say if indicator2 equals 0. And so these are strings, not numbers, even though they are 0, because an indicator, maybe anything could be in there, right? Even though maybe not usually, but it's stored as a string, not as an actual number, so we have to put in quotes. Alright, so if it's 0, then we'll say, okay, add this subject heading to the topical, right? Because 0 is topical. So push this one in there, and we'll call it, the value is stored in record. So we're looping through all the fields here, so it's stored in F. And that is stored in subfield A, right? So F subfield A. Else if the indicator 2 is set to, what's our other one we have? 5, which means geographic. And then we're going to set it to push it into our geographic instead. And just quickly, we'll just do the same for 6, which we said was genre form. Alright, so let's print each piece of data as it is generated. After we loop through everything, we'll get rid of this. And then let's run it and see what happens. So it's no push. Alright, my apologies. So that's in JavaScript. So we're doing append in Python. We don't do push. That's not the right command method. Alright, so append. Alright, and so we have the title here, and then we have topical, and geographic, and form. And it looks like we're storing title twice for some reason. Messed up somewhere here. Let's see. Yeah. Title. Let's try it again. Alright, title, topical, geographic, and form, right? So we could do all sorts of stuff with this now that we have our own data. Let's push this into kind of like our all data. And so we have all data, and we'll append our data that we just created in there. Now we have it kind of stored in our list. And let's just import JSON for later, and we'll save this out as JSON. So we'll say JSON dot, we'll open the file first, we'll say open, we'll say with open, we'll call this subject.json as write, as out file, and we'll say json.dump, and we're going to dump it. We're going to dump the variable auth data, which has all of our data in there, into the out file, and we're going to also say indent it for us, please. All right, so let's run that again. All right, and let's see how it looks. All right, it looks pretty good. So we'd have to decide what we want to do. We could do some analysis saying, like, you know, what are the most common topical subjects by form, or we could say what are the most common, you know, topical subjects by geographic. All those sorts of things we could do. We could also add more data in here if we look through here and see something else that's interesting. So the 856 field looks interesting, right? So that's like looks like the URL to the actual asset, or maybe information about the asset on the web page. So we probably want to store that too. So let's add that in. So we know it's an 856 subfield U. So let's go back to our code and add that in. So we'll say URL. And we'll say, okay, we also, when we're adding the data here, the title, we'll say data URL equals record 856 subfield U. And so it's curious to know, you know, what would happen if there were no fields for some of the records, right? So say, 856, right? Typo there. So say, for example, though, say we had a, not in U, but in P, right? Maybe there isn't even a P. Let's see what it does if it can't find that data. Alright, so it didn't really care if it was there or not. It just kind of kept on chugging. And so it just didn't work, right? So that's pretty nice. We don't have to worry about checking to see if it exists first before we try to add it. But we know it's an 856 in subfield U, so let's see this again. Alright, and then it stores the information. Let's take a look at one of these URLs and see what's actually there. Alright. Alright, so it's like slightly more. You'd have to see if this information is actually in the MARC record too, or if there's more information here that's not in the MARC record, but it could be another source of information. Well, let's quickly do one of our ideas of, like, let's find all the most common topical subject headings by geographic location, right? So we had two options now. So we created a new file that kind of took what we wanted and dumped it into a new file. So we could do that in here, or we could work with the new file, right? So let's just work with the new file because that sounds a little easier. So we'll make a new Python record here, a new Python file. We're going to import JSON. And we're going to call this, not parse, but we're going to call this, you know, explore or something. .py. And so now we have to open, so we'll say with open the file that we're saving out, which is called subject.json, as in file. And we'll say, okay, our data is going to be stored in json.load and then the in file. Let's just make sure it worked. We'll say print data. All right. So we're going to run that second file. So it worked, right? So this is nice because it doesn't have to have the overhead of loading up PyMark and looping through everything and doing all the extra work. And we can just kind of work on this file now that we have all the data pulled out that we want to do something with. So we want to find anything that has a geographic heading and then figure out which are the most common topical terms for that geographic heading. So there's a lot of ways to do this, right? But one thing we could do is we're going to always need to loop through our data. And so for each record, we need to first test to see if there's a geographic heading at all, right? So we could say if the data, or sorry, if the record has a geographic heading, right? Geographic. And we just want to make sure that the length of that is bigger than 0, right? So if it's bigger than 0, then it has a geographic heading and we can do something with it. And so end with a colon. So if this is true, and we don't need these parentheses here, if that's true, then we know we want to do something with that record. So we probably want to loop through each geographic heading. And let's just print it out for now, just to see if this works. Yeah, right? So print it out each one. So what we could do, there's a lot of different ways of doing this, but we could just do this the same way we just did earlier. We could just say like, okay, geo lookup, and this could be an empty dictionary. And so we could test to say like, if geo is not in geo lookup, then geo lookup geo is going to be equal to a new empty dictionary. And so then once we've created that, we can then test, we can loop through the topical ones, right? So we could say for topical in record, and we call it, we're calling this topical. So for topical in record topical, and then so for each one of those, we know that the specific geo is going to be in the geographic lookup, and then we just want to maybe make sure that this topical is in that geographic lookup, and then if it is, if it's not, create it, set it to 0, and then if it is, add 1 to it, right? So we can say, okay, geographic lookup, so we'll say is if, we'll say if this topical not in the specific geo lookup for the specific location, then we'll set it, right? We'll say geographic geo lookup geo topical is set to 0. So now we have it setting to 0, and then the last thing we need to do is add 1 to it. And so if we print this at the end, we'd see hopefully all the geographic terms, and then we'd see the topical terms underneath of them, right? Okay, so something, it pretty much worked, we think, but let's just dump this out as JSON. Instead of printing it to the file, we'll say with open results.json as write as out file. We'll say print, or we'll say JSON.dump to out, or dump the geo lookup to the out file as, and also indent it. Alright, so if we look at that file, results, we can see here by geographic term, we've stored all the topical headings and kind of gave them a count. So we can go through each one of these topical or geographic locations and then figure out which is the highest topical term for that. So you could sort this, or you could just kind of loop through and print the highest value. or you can just even just eyeball it, right? You can see what's most popular. You could output this as a CSV file and import it into a Excel or something and make a little pie chart or a histogram or something like that. But we've gone from converting, start working with these kind of raw MARC files and distilled down to something more specific and much more useful, rather than just the XML file. So I think that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.